Whether from poor engineering, cutting corners on safety, or just flat-out ignorance, these cars put lives at risk. Exploding fuel tanks, collapsing frames, brakes that didn't brake, steering that didn't steer. These weren't just design blunders. They were vehicular betrayals of public trust. And while the companies cashed checks, too many American drivers paid the price in injuries and worse. Here are 10 dangerous American cars so bad, so reckless, so disgraceful, you won't believe they were real or legal.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 10, the 1980 Ford Mustang, specifically the third-generation early Fox body models. A car that marked a dramatic departure from the bloated muscle machines of the 1970s. While enthusiasts often look back fondly on the Fox body era for its tuning potential and lighter structure, the reality is that the early 1980 models fell flat when it came to safety, braking, and crash survivability. This wasn't the Mustang that saved the brand. It was the Mustang that tried to modernize the formula too quickly and too cheaply. By 1980, the Mustang was no longer the carefree, high-powered pony car of the 1960s. The second-generation Mustang II had left a sour taste, and the oil crisis, emissions regulations, and economic uncertainty meant that Ford had to rethink everything. The result was the all-new Fox body Mustang, built on Ford's lightweight, rear-wheel drive Fox platform, which was shared with everything from the Fairmont to the Lincoln Continental. That was the first sign of trouble. The platform wasn't inherently sports car-oriented, and it certainly wasn't engineered for performance and crash survivability the way it should have been for something still pretending to be a muscle car. The 1980 Mustang looked modern by 1979 standards. Boxy, clean lines, a sloped nose, and a European-inspired liftback available alongside the notchback coupe. It was lighter and more efficient looking, but also noticeably less muscular. There were few curves and almost no visual aggression. Worse, its appearance may have signaled speed and sharpness, but its engineering couldn't back up the image. One of the biggest knocks against the 1980 Mustang was its shoddy crashworthiness, especially in frontal collisions. Crash tests from the era showed that the car's structure collapsed too easily, particularly around the footwell and A-pillar. There were no real crumple zones, just thin metal and basic welds that didn't stand up well to even moderate impacts. Side impact protection was nearly non-existent. Reinforcements in the doors were minimal, and intrusion into the cabin was severe. The steering column had a nasty tendency to move inward toward the driver in a crash. In an era when even economy cars were beginning to adopt better energy-absorbing structures, the Mustang seemed a step behind, despite its forward-looking image. You might expect a car called Mustang, even in its leaner 1980 form, to at least stop with authority. The 1980 Mustang came standard with front disc and rear drum brakes, but they were undersized. Braking distances were poor, especially in panic stops or when the car was fully loaded. The brake fade under repeated use was severe, particularly in hotter climates or aggressive driving. No ABS was available, and the car had a tendency to lock up the rear wheels, causing instability in emergency maneuvers. While the Mustang could handle curves better than its predecessors, its inability to reliably slow down undermined any sporty credibility it had. To make matters worse, early Fox Mustangs were underwhelming in performance, meaning you weren't even getting the speed to justify the poor safety trade-offs. The base engine in 1980 was a 2.3-liter inline-4 with just 88 horsepower. Optional engines included a 255 cubic inch 4.2-liter V8 that barely mustered 119 horsepower, a sad downgrade from the former 5.0-liter. The car looked fast, but the powertrain lineup was anemic, and the risk you took driving one wasn't balanced by thrilling speed. So, not only was the Mustang dangerous in a crash, it also wasn't fast enough to escape one. Airbags? Not yet. Not even as an option. Seatbelts? Sure, but the three-point belts were cheaply mounted and belt tensioners were crude. The dash and steering wheel were made of hard plastics that posed a serious injury risk during impact. The cabin design lacked thoughtful safety ergonomics. It wasn't built to protect occupants, just to carry them. In essence, the Mustang's interior was styled for appearance. The Mustang was important. It was the start of a generation that would eventually give us the revered 5.0 GTs and the SVT Cobras of the late 1980s and early 90s. But in 1980, the model was still half-baked. It lacked the power of a real muscle car, the braking of a modern coupe, and the safety of a responsible commuter. Enthusiasts may love the Fox-body Mustang in hindsight, but the first-year cars were fragile, underpowered, and risky to drive, even by the standards of the time. Number 9, the 1960 Chevrolet Corvair, specifically the first-generation model that ran through 1964. Marketed as a stylish, rear-engine compact to counter European imports and Ford's Falcon, the Corvair was a bold experiment from General Motors. But what started as innovation soon unraveled into scandal. The Corvair became the centerpiece of Ralph Nader's 1965 expose, Unsafe at Any Speed, which accused GM of knowingly producing a car with dangerous handling characteristics. So let's examine the Corvair's unique design, its safety shortcomings, and how it ultimately sparked a consumer safety revolution. By 1960, the American car market was changing. Imports like the Volkswagen Beetle were gaining traction, and Detroit's land yachts were no longer appealing to economy-minded families. Enter the Corvair, Chevrolet's answer to foreign compacts. It was lightweight, rear-engined, and featured independent suspension, a technical departure from the body-on-frame, front-engine, rear-drive formula that had dominated the 1950s. But Chevrolet's desire to reinvent the compact car came with dangerous compromises. The Corvair's most defining feature was its rear-mounted air-cooled flat-six engine, directly inspired by European designs like the VW Beetle and Porsche 356. Freed-up cabin and front trunk space, offered better traction in snow or rain due to rear weight bias, allowed a lower hood line and stylish silhouette, heavily rear-biased weight distribution, poor cooling at high speeds, exacerbated handling issues under load changes. This layout made the Corvair behave differently from anything American drivers were used to, and not in a good way. The Corvair's most infamous feature was its rear swing axle suspension. Unlike more sophisticated independent rear suspensions, swing axles don't allow the wheel to maintain optimal contact with the road during cornering. As the vehicle rolls in a turn, the swing axle causes extreme camber change in the rear wheels. Tuck-under behavior, where the wheel tips inward dramatically. Sudden and severe oversteer, even at moderate speeds. In layman's terms, if you cornered too hard in a first-gen Corvair, especially if the rear tires were underinflated, as they often were, the car could suddenly whip around, skid out, or even roll over. Even worse, GM knew about it. Chevrolet attempted to mitigate the swing axle's instability by recommending 15 pounds per square inch in the front tires, 26 pounds per square inch in the rear tires. This created artificial understeer to counter the car's natural tendency to oversteer. But here's the problem. Few owners maintained those exact pressures. Tire shops routinely inflated them equally, unaware of the need for imbalance. Underinflated rear tires made the rear suspension more unstable, dramatically increasing rollover risk. So the car's safety depended on precise, unorthodox tire inflation, which was unrealistic in real-world use. Beyond its handling issues, the early Corvair had no front-end crumple zone, a thin steering column that could impale the driver in a frontal collision, minimal side impact protection, a fuel tank in the front, dangerously close to the crumple area. The car's light body and rear engine setup shifted impact forces in unnatural ways. Occupants were poorly protected in almost any type of collision. In 1965, consumer advocate Ralph Nader published his bombshell book, Unsafe at Any Speed, which opened with a chapter titled The Sporty Corvair, the One-Car Accident. Nader accused General Motors of ignoring internal tests that showed the swing axle suspension was unsafe, choosing cost savings over engineering fixes, such as adding a front stabilizer bar, blaming drivers for accidents caused by poor design. GM responded not with engineering rebuttals, but by attempting to discredit Nader, hiring private investigators to dig up dirt on him. A move that backfired spectacularly and earned Nader national sympathy. Congress took notice, and by 1966, the U.S. passed the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, creating what we now know as NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. In effect, the Corvair didn't just crash, it crashed into history, sparking the modern consumer auto safety movement. To GM's credit, the 1965 Corvair redesign did correct many of the flaws. It adopted a fully independent rear suspension, similar to the Corvette. Handling improved dramatically. The car was actually fun and relatively safe. Too little, too late. Public trust had already eroded, and by 1969, the Corvair was gone. Number 8, the 1958 Buick Special, a car that wore the glitzy badge of mid-century American optimism, but fell flat when it came to basic driver protection. As we explore this vehicle, we'll uncover how Detroit's obsession with chrome, bulk, and image often came at the expense of engineering sensibility and passenger safety. Though the Buick Special was a popular car in its day, offering perceived luxury at a reasonable price, it also stands as a sobering reminder of how little the auto industry valued safety in the late 1950s. Let's begin with the backdrop. By 1958, the American car industry was deep in a styling arms race. Automakers, especially General Motors, were piling on chrome, extending tail fins and lowering rooflines to woo customers. Function took a back seat to flash. Cars were growing larger, heavier, and flashier each year, not necessarily better. The Buick Special, despite its name, was a low-tier model within Buick's lineup, positioned as an affordable full-size car with just enough style to look upscale. But beneath that shiny surface was an outdated, under-engineered machine. Visually, the 1958 Buick Special is unforgettable, for better or worse. Buick designers used what they called a fashion-air Dynastar grille, a latticework of squares that looked like a cheese grater dipped in glitter. Unlike Cadillac's single dramatic fin, Buick stacked 3 small ones on each side, creating a cluttered, confused look. Chrome streaks ran down the flanks and wrapped the wheel wells, giving the car a bloated appearance. It was as if designers took every piece of bright work they could find and glued it onto the car. The result was a visual circus, not a cohesive design, and none of it contributed to safety, aerodynamics, or efficiency. While the Buick Special gleamed in the showroom, it was grossly deficient in safety technology, even by the modest standards of the 1950s. Most 1958 cars, including the Special, did not come with seatbelts as standard equipment. Seatbelts were optional, and most buyers didn't opt for them. This meant that in any collision, occupants were launched into the dashboard, steering column, or windshield. The interior surfaces were made of metal and rigid plastic, with no padding. Dashboards, steering wheels, and knobs became blunt force trauma devices in a crash. There were no collapsible steering columns, meaning in a crash, head-on crash, the driver was often impaled by the wheel. The 1958 Buick Special came with 4-wheel drum brakes, which were already becoming outdated, overheated quickly during hard or repeated stops, suffered from fade, braking efficiency dropped when they got hot, performed poorly in wet weather, leading to long stopping distances. This was especially troubling on a vehicle weighing over 4,000 pounds, a heavy machine that demanded much better stopping power than its brakes could provide. The Buick Special used a recirculating ball steering system, typical for the era, but not particularly precise. The steering ratio was slow, requiring several turns lock to lock. Combined with a soft suspension and a high center of gravity, it had vague cornering feel and sluggish response in emergency maneuvers. On a twisty road or in a sudden evasive action, the car handled like a land yacht adrift in molasses. The post-war boom brought more cars to the highways, and the Buick Special simply wasn't equipped to deal with sustained high-speed travel. At 60+ miles per hour, the car floated due to its over-soft suspension. Crosswinds could buffet the car, moving it across lanes unpredictably. Combined with the underpowered brakes and loose steering, this made long-distance driving feel more like piloting a boat in a storm than driving a car. In essence, the 1958 Special was designed for appearance, not performance, especially not safety performance. Mechanically, the car was acceptable for its time, using Buick's Nailhead V8 and a 2-speed Dynaflow automatic transmission. However, the X-frame chassis used by GM in this period had no side rails. This meant side impact protection was almost non-existent. In a T-bone collision, the force would transfer directly into the passenger cabin, with little to absorb or deflect energy. This was a structural flaw that went largely unchallenged until crash testing became more common decades later. In 1958, buyers didn't think much about crash tests or rollover ratings. What mattered were Dynaflow drive, fashion air venti ports, and looking like your car cost more than your neighbor's. Safety was marketed with vague terms like solid construction or power brakes, not with any real substance. It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s, with mounting fatalities and the advocacy of people like Ralph Nader, that the cracks in these chrome-heavy dinosaurs were truly exposed. Number 7, the 1959 Chevrolet Impala, a car that dazzled the American public with its flamboyant styling and space-age flair, yet concealed one of the most notorious engineering compromises of its era, the X-frame chassis. While it earned its place as a cultural icon, the '59 Impala also stands as a cautionary tale in automotive design, a vehicle where form overwhelmed function and safety was an afterthought. By 1959, the American car industry was neck-deep in a styling war. Tail fins were shooting skyward, chrome was applied with reckless abandon, and cars grew longer and lower each year. Manufacturers weren't selling engineering. They were selling dreams, wrapped in two-tone paint and studded with rocket-age fantasy. The 1959 Chevrolet Impala emerged at the peak of this design mania. It was Chevrolet's top trim model, meant to showcase luxury and style in a value-priced package. And on those fronts, it succeeded. The Impala's appearance was bold and unmistakable. Not just tall, these wings stretched outward like a bird mid-flight. Replacing the traditional round lights, they mimicked jet exhaust ports, wraparound windshield and deep rear overhang. It looked longer and lower than ever before. Chrome trim, two-tone upholstery, and a steering wheel that looked more decorative than functional. To the casual observer in 1959, this car screamed progress and prosperity. But underneath the dramatic sheet metal lurked a critical design flaw: General Motors' infamous X-frame. In 1958, GM introduced the X-frame chassis, marketed as the safety girder frame. Despite the name, it was anything but safe. Instead of traditional side rails running parallel along the perimeter of the vehicle, the X-frame used a central cruciform shape, like an X stretching between the front and rear. It lacked full outer side rails, which are critical in absorbing and dispersing energy during side impacts. The car's body essentially hung on top of the X, with minimal lateral reinforcement. The X-frame allowed for lower body profiles, no need for side rails, a flatter floor pan, a smoother, sleeker look, perfect for the low and long design language of the late 1950s. But this came at the cost of occupant protection, particularly in side impact collisions. While frontal collisions were often survivable in big American cars due to sheer mass, side impacts exposed the fatal weakness of the 1959 Impala's structure. In a T-bone crash, there was virtually nothing to absorb the impact. The intrusion path led directly into the passenger cabin. With no reinforced door beams, no crumple zones, and a flimsy floor structure, the force went straight to the occupants. Seatbelts were optional, and most buyers didn't choose them. Steering columns weren't collapsible. Hard dashboards and protruding trim added to the injury risk. A side impact at even moderate speeds could turn the driver and passengers into projectiles inside a thin-walled, poorly protected metal box. Why would GM make such a dangerous structural choice? The focus was on visual appeal and mass production, not crashworthiness. Executives prioritized the longer, lower, wider mantra that defined late 50s design. Buyers were sold on comfort and looks, not survivability. In 1959, there were no federal crash safety standards, no mandatory seatbelts, no requirements for crumple zones, no oversight. Automakers could cut corners without consequence, until the fatal results became too glaring to ignore in the 1960s. The weaknesses of the X-frame became obvious by the early 1960s. Crash tests conducted later on these vehicles revealed horrifying results in side impacts. Studies showed that occupants in GM's X-frame cars were at significantly higher risk of injury or death. Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, 1965, didn't directly target the '59 Impala, but it shattered the public's trust in auto manufacturers who made unsafe vehicles and passed them off as modern marvels. By 1965, GM phased out the X-frame, replacing it with more conventional perimeter frame designs that offered better crash protection. Too late for the hundreds of thousands of X-frame vehicles already on the road. Today, the 1959 Impala is a collector's favorite, especially among lowrider communities and classic car fans. But its cultural rebirth doesn't erase its structural flaws. It's admired for its striking silhouette, but those same design cues are exactly what compromised its integrity. The car's legacy is a dual narrative, one of innovation in visual language and one of stagnation, or outright regression, in safety. Number 6, the 1970 AMC Gremlin. Launched on April Fool's Day of all dates, the Gremlin became a punchline both for its styling and for what it represented, a hasty, budget-minded response to the growing popularity of imported subcompacts. But beyond its unusual looks and marketing, the Gremlin's shortcomings in crash safety, occupant protection, and basic structural engineering make it a case study in how not to design a small car in a time of changing expectations. By the late 1960s, foreign compacts, particularly from Volkswagen, Toyota, and Datsun, were cutting into the American market. AMC, the smallest of the U.S. automakers, was already struggling to stay afloat. The Gremlin was AMC's rushed attempt to compete in the subcompact space without investing in a brand new platform. Based on a shortened AMC Hornet chassis, introduced in 1970, making it America's first modern subcompact, positioned as cute, fun, and frugal, but the end product had far more flaws than charm. Let's talk about what made the Gremlin instantly stand out, often for the wrong reasons. The Gremlin looked like someone had chopped off the rear of a station wagon with a guillotine. The hatchback wasn't really a hatchback. It was a trunk with a large glass panel. The long hood and stubby tail gave it an awkward, hunched-over stance. The cabin was utilitarian in the worst way. Exposed metal panels, vinyl seats, and minimal padding. The dash had sharp edges, and there was little in the way of thoughtful ergonomics. While AMC claimed the Gremlin was ruggedly simple, it came off more as crude and unfinished, especially compared to imported rivals. Here's where the Gremlin's real issues came to light, in its crash safety or lack thereof. At just 96 inches, the wheelbase was too short for stable handling at highway speeds. The car was top-heavy, especially when fitted with AMC's inline-six engine. In emergency maneuvers, it was prone to rear-wheel hop, fishtailing, or spinouts. The Gremlin used a cut-down unibody derived from the Hornet, but removing that rear length weakened torsional rigidity. There was no real crash engineering, no crumple zones, no reinforced doors. In frontal or side impact collisions, the vehicle performed poorly by any objective standard, even for the era. AMC left large swaths of interior metal exposed to reduce production costs. In a collision, these hard surfaces increased the risk of head trauma and lacerations. Early models lacked energy-absorbing steering columns, and even basic three-point seat belts were not standard across all trims. It's no exaggeration to say that in a crash, the Gremlin provided little more than sheet metal and wishful thinking between its occupants and injury. The Gremlin was riddled with engineering choices that prioritized cost over quality or performance. Base models used AMC's 232 cubic inches straight six, a bulky engine for a small car. This led to poor weight distribution, nose-heavy behavior, and handling imbalances. A V8 version was later introduced, adding power, but worsening the safety and control issues. Rear suspension was leaf-sprung, leading to a jittery, truck-like ride. Brakes were non-powered drum units on most trims, weak and prone to fade under stress. The car's ride quality and braking response were below average even by 1970 standards. AMC tried to sell the Gremlin as a fun, hip, youthful car, but its design and construction told a different story. Commercials showed it zipping around with college students, but real-world owners found it unrefined and cheaply built. The price was attractive, starting under $2,000. But that affordability came at the expense of safety, comfort, and refinement. In essence, the Gremlin was a bare-bones commuter car dressed in an oddball wrapper with little substance to back its quirky style. Over time, the Gremlin gained a cult following, mostly for its weirdness and novelty, not its quality. Appeared in movies, shows, and satirical art. Loved by some for its "so ugly it's cool" aesthetic. Automotive safety analysts have since cited the Gremlin as a prime example of early subcompact pitfalls. No structural integrity, no occupant protection, no foresight in crash survivability. It became part of a generation of cars that helped spark regulatory reform in automotive safety throughout the 1970s. Number 5, the 1985 Yugo GV. Marketed as a car everyone could afford, it came with a price tag under $4,000 and a reputation that quickly became synonymous with failure, danger, and poor engineering. The Yugo GV wasn't just a bad car by American standards. It was a car that fundamentally misunderstood what American drivers expected in terms of safety, reliability, and basic mechanical competence. Imported from Yugoslavia and sold by automotive entrepreneur Malcolm Bricklin, the Yugo GV has earned its place in history not for innovation or accessibility, but for just how badly a car can miss the mark. The Yugo was originally produced in Kragujevac, Yugoslavia, by Zastava Automobiles. The company had a long-standing license agreement with Fiat, and the Yugo GV was essentially a reworked version of the Fiat 127 from the early 1970s. In 1985, Malcolm Bricklin, the same man who imported Subarus to the US and briefly built the Bricklin SV1, saw an opportunity to market a bare-bones subcompact for the budget-conscious American consumer. GV stood for great value, though that title was heavily ironic in hindsight. Base price, $3,990, making it the cheapest new car available in America. Sold through a growing network of dealerships with heavy marketing behind it. But that's where the optimism ended. While based on a decent Italian design, the Yugo was assembled under conditions that left quality control as an afterthought. The Fiat 127 platform was already over a decade old by the time the Yugo GV reached America. Rear beam axle, front McPherson struts, functional but primitive. Thin sheet metal and lack of proper corrosion protection led to rapid rusting. The interior was plastic heavy, rattly, and rough to the touch. Switchgear was cheap, and dashboard components often didn't align. Ventilation controls and gauges were so inconsistent, they sometimes failed straight from the dealership. Panel gaps were irregular, paint often flaked or peeled early. Doors sometimes didn't line up, a sign of inconsistent stamping and welding. The entire car screamed cost-cutting in ways that were immediately visible, and soon painfully experienced. Powered by a 1.1-liter inline-4, making around 55 horsepower. Paired with a 4-speed manual that was notchy and vague. Acceleration was leisurely at best. 0 to 60 miles per hour took over 14 seconds. Handling was tippy and unpredictable, especially in emergency maneuvers. Brakes were non-power-assisted drum brakes in the rear, which faded quickly. On the highway, the car felt unstable and unsafe above 60 miles per hour. Simply put, the Yugo didn't inspire confidence behind the wheel. It was a city car with poor road manners and almost no safety margin when pushed. This is where the Yugo GV truly earned its infamy. In HTSA crash tests, the Yugo performed poorly across the board. Frontal crashes showed high forces transmitted to the dummy's head and chest. Side impact protection was nearly non-existent. No door beams, no structural reinforcement. The car's thin body panels crumpled easily even in low-speed collisions. The roof crush resistance was below federal minimums. A rollover could be deadly. There were no airbags or anti-lock brakes, which wasn't unusual in 1985, but the car lagged even by the basic standards of the time. Insurance companies flagged the Yugo as a high-risk vehicle. It was often prohibited from rental fleets and discouraged by safety advocates. In a collision, the Yugo offered almost no real protection. It was a rolling tin can with 4 seats and a steering wheel. You'd expect a simple car to at least be dependable, but that wasn't the case here. Timing belts snapped prematurely, often destroying the engine. Electrical systems were infamous for shorts and failures. Headlights and wipers would simply stop working. Clutches wore out rapidly, and gearboxes often failed within 30,000 miles. Many dealers lacked spare parts, leading to long wait times. Some owners had their cars sit in shops for months, waiting on parts from Yugoslavia. Even basic maintenance became a chore, and resale values collapsed quickly. Despite an initial wave of curiosity, the Yugo's reputation quickly spiraled. Late-night talk shows and comedians tore it apart. Consumer Reports listed it as one of the worst cars they ever tested. By the early 1990s, the Yugo had become a cultural punchline, representing the worst traits of automotive design: cheap, unsafe, and unreliable. While Bricklin had some success with Subaru, the Yugo experiment ultimately tarnished his reputation in the industry. He later tried importing other low-cost cars, like China's Sherry, but was largely unsuccessful. Number 4, the 1973 Ford Country Squire Wagon. This was a car built during an era when bigger meant better, at least in theory. The Country Squire was marketed as the perfect solution for growing suburban families, boasting acres of faux wood paneling, seating for up to 9, and enough bulk to rival small boats. But underneath its massive proportions and vinyl trim was a reality few buyers understood until too late. The 1973 Country Squire was poorly engineered, dangerously soft in its handling. It was based on the full-size Ford LTD platform, sharing its V8 powertrains, body-on-frame construction, and floaty ride quality. At over 19 feet long, the 73 Country Squire was longer than some delivery vans, and it weighed more than 4,800 pounds depending on equipment. Target audience: suburban families needing to haul kids, luggage, and groceries. Market position: upper middle-class station wagon, competing with the Chevy Kingswood and Chrysler Town & Country. Styling: faux wood paneling, chrome roof racks, hidden headlamps, and enough girth to dominate your cul-de-sac. But its looks and size concealed some serious flaws. Driving the Country Squire was like piloting a barge through a storm. Ford prioritized comfort, not control, which led to a suspension setup that was soft to the point of being dangerous. The car had coil springs and soft shocks, tuned for maximum float over road imperfections. This resulted in excessive body roll, vague steering, and an overall feeling of disconnectedness from the road. Equipped with power-assisted steering, it was light, too light, and completely numb. It had a huge turning radius, making parking a challenge and emergency maneuvers nearly impossible. Despite its bulk, the 1973 model often came with front disc and rear drum brakes, which faded easily under load. There was no ABS, and the brake pedal feel was mushy at best, a terrifying combination at highway speeds. The Country Squire's behavior in evasive situations was unpredictable. For a family wagon, that made it dangerously ill-suited to the real world. Most buyers assumed that a car this big had to be safe. That was a common misconception, and in the case of the 1973 Ford Country Squire, a dangerous one. Though large, the body-on-frame chassis didn't offer modern crumple zones or strong side impact protection. No reinforced door beams in early 73 models, which meant side collisions could be catastrophic. Roof structure was weak. In a rollover, the long wagon body could collapse inward. Front seat belts were available, but not required to be worn, and rear seat belts were often omitted or unused. No airbags, no head restraints in the third-row seats, and no child safety accommodations. Rear-facing third-row seats were crammed above the rear axle, with minimal crash protection. In a rear-end collision, especially one involving a gas leak, these passengers were incredibly vulnerable. Its enormous bulk may have crushed smaller cars in accidents, but that didn't mean its own passengers were safe inside. Quite the opposite. The Country Squire had dangerous blind spots, weak side impact zones, and poor crash energy distribution. The 1973 Country Squire came with a range of big block V8 engines, the most common being the 400 or 429 cubic inch V8s. Even with 200 to 260 horsepower, this car was underpowered by its own mass. It took over 10 seconds to reach 60 miles per hour, and cornering was sluggish and boat-like. The fuel economy was catastrophic, even by 1970s standards. Most owners saw 8 to 10 miles per gallon, sometimes worse when fully loaded or towing. In an era soon to be rocked by the oil crisis, the Country Squire was the poster child for American inefficiency, and the worst part was, it didn't even offer performance in return. Let's talk about aesthetics and functionality. The wood grain applique was plastic trim glued to the metal, and it aged terribly. It cracked, peeled, and faded, giving a once luxury car the appearance of a rotting deck chair. Plush bench seats that encouraged lounging rather than proper posture. Control layout was basic, with hard plastics and fake chrome trim throughout. Yes, the Country Squire could carry a lot, but accessing that space was a challenge. The tailgate was complicated, often called the magic door gate, which could swing open sideways or drop down, but frequently jammed or misaligned. Functionality was compromised by Ford's obsession with gimmicks and style over engineering. Number 3, the 1978 Dodge Omni and the Plymouth Horizon. These were among the first American attempts to build a true front-wheel drive subcompact with European sensibilities. Efficient, maneuverable, and affordable. On paper, they represented a bold leap forward, but in execution, they fell apart. Quite literally. They arrived at a time when the American public was growing weary of gas guzzlers and demanding smaller, more practical transportation. Chrysler, desperate for a hit, rushed these twins to market. Unfortunately, that rush led to compromised engineering, poor build quality, and persistent mechanical problems that quickly destroyed their reputation. Let's start with context. By the mid-1970s, Chrysler was on the ropes financially and had no real small car offering that could compete with popular imports like the Volkswagen Rabbit, Toyota Corolla, or Honda Civic. The answer came from Europe, specifically Chrysler's struggling French subsidiary, Simca. The Dodge Omni and Plymouth Horizon were based heavily on the Simca 1100, a French front-wheel drive hatchback. Chrysler Americanized the design, added U.S. spec bumpers and emission systems, and launched both models in late 1977 as 1978 model year cars. They were front-wheel drive, four-door hatchbacks with transverse-mounted engines, a major departure from the rear-wheel drive norm in American cars of the era. At first, they were praised for their innovation, but reality would catch up fast. From a technical perspective, the Omni and Horizon were groundbreaking for Chrysler, but innovation without refinement leads to disaster, and these cars prove that. Powered by a 1.7-liter engine sourced from Volkswagen, yes, ironically, mated to a 4-speed manual or 3-speed automatic. The engine was underpowered and rough at idle, and the carburetor systems were notoriously unreliable. Later years would switch to Chrysler-built engines, but problems persisted with starting, hesitation, and stalling. WD was still rare in 1987 American cars, and early Omni/Horizon models had quirky handling traits, particularly under hard acceleration or braking. Torque steer and bump steer were common, and the steering system had excessive play in a vague on-center feel. The cars rode on McPherson struts up front and torsion beams in the rear, which should have given them good handling. But cheap materials and poor assembly meant creaks, groans, and an unsettled ride over anything but smooth pavement. They were trying to offer European refinement on a domestic budget, and it just didn't add up. This is where the Omni and Horizon truly earned their reputation as flimsy, frustrating cars. Thin sheet metal was prone to rust within just a few years, especially in northern climates. Door gaps were inconsistent, seals leaked, and trim pieces fell off with alarming regularity. The interior plastics were cheap and brittle, and dashboard cracks became common within the first few years. Chrysler's factories were not ready to build a car this advanced. Early examples were plagued with misaligned panels, faulty electrical connections, poor paint adhesion. Reports of brand new cars needing warranty repairs within weeks were not uncommon. In short, the Omni Horizon was a car built by a company in crisis, using unfamiliar methods, rushed timelines, and outdated quality control. While the Omni and Horizon looked like practical urban runabouts, they were hiding a number of alarming safety issues. One of the most notorious defects was brake system unreliability. Owners reported brake pedal fade, soft response, and total failure due to poor quality components and improperly adjusted systems. Brake lines were prone to corrosion, and early master cylinders were poorly sealed. In crash testing, the Omni and Horizon performed poorly in side and offset impacts. The thin unibody structure lacked proper crumple zones and door reinforcements, offering minimal protection in real-world collisions. The floor pan and firewall could flex under stress, leading to premature squeaks, rattles, and even cracks. In an era when safety was becoming a growing concern, these cars felt fragile, not secure. Number 2, the 1984 Pontiac Fiero. This was a car that looked like a sports car, promised futuristic technology, and even pioneered an affordable mid-engine layout. But in reality, it became known for poor performance, serious reliability issues, and, quite infamously, a tendency to catch fire. While it looked like Pontiac had delivered a budget-friendly, exotic-looking sports car, the first-year Fiero was more of a public relations hazard than a revolution. Let's unpack what happened and why the Fiero remains a cautionary tale in automotive design. Let's start with what made the Fiero such a big deal in 1984. At a time when GM was known for bloated sedans and uninspired coupes, Pontiac shocked the industry by releasing a mid-engine, two-seat sports car. It was sleek and futuristic, with pop-up headlights and an aerodynamic wedge-shaped profile. Relatively affordable, starting under $8,000. Designed for efficiency, not pure performance, something GM emphasized early on. It was the first mass-produced mid-engine car by an American company. On styling alone, it looked like a scaled-down Ferrari or Lotus, especially to buyers used to boxy K cars or dated muscle car leftovers. But under that striking body lurked some serious compromises. Pontiac engineers wanted the Fiero to be a true sports car, but GM management undercut the project's goals by positioning it as a commuter car with sporty styling, not a performance machine. The chassis used recycled components from GM's parts bin, including front suspension from the Chevy Chevette and rear suspension from the Chevy Citation. Handling was decent for casual drivers, but true enthusiasts found it underwhelming and twitchy, especially at higher speeds. The 1984 model came with a 2.5-liter Iron Duke four-cylinder engine, producing just 92 horsepower. That might have been acceptable for a commuter car, but it was a huge disappointment for a vehicle that looked like a sports car. Acceleration was sluggish. 0 to 60 miles per hour took over 10 seconds. So here was a car that looked like a Ferrari, but drove like a Chevette with an identity crisis. The most notorious issue with the 1984 Pontiac Fiero was not its power or handling. It was engine fires, and not just a few. We're talking dozens of documented fires, often occurring in relatively new vehicles. The Iron Duke engine suffered from leaky connecting rods and valve covers, which spilled oil into the engine bay. These oil leaks frequently dripped onto the hot exhaust manifold, igniting fires. The Fiero's mid-engine layout was exotic, but the cooling and ventilation system was inadequate. This meant excessive engine bay heat, compounding the risk of fire when oil was leaking or if owners neglected oil changes. In some cases, overheating led to cracked blocks or warped components. GM admitted the issue only after mounting pressure, and finally issued a massive recall in 1987, covering over 125,000 Fieros from the 1984 model year alone. At the time, Pontiac tried to downplay the seriousness, but it was clear the first-year Fiero had a deadly design flaw. Even if your Fiero didn't catch fire, it likely had other issues. Cheap plastics, rattling panels, and easily faded materials gave the interior a disposable feel. Electrical gremlins, malfunctioning gauges, and cracked dash pads were common within just a few years. The Fiero was built at GM's Plant 17 in Pontiac, Michigan, where workers were under pressure to build high volumes with a learning curve for a unique layout. The result? Misaligned panels, door gaps, poor weather sealing, and constant quality complaints. In short, it was a flimsy, frustrating experience beneath the flashy exterior. When the Fiero debuted, it was met with excitement. Over 136,000 units sold in its first year. It was one of the most successful new product launches GM had seen in years. But the shine wore off fast. Word of engine fires spread, and lawsuits followed. Enthusiasts were disappointed by the lackluster performance. Recalls and mechanical breakdowns plagued dealer service departments. By the time GM began fixing the car, improving suspension geometry, adding a V6, and upgrading materials in 1985 and later, the damage was done. The Fiero was discontinued after 1988, just as it was finally becoming the car it was meant to be. Number 1, the 1981 Chrysler K Car, specifically the Plymouth Reliant and Dodge Aries. Now, some might say the K Car saved Chrysler from collapse, and there's truth to that. But what often gets glossed over is how poorly built, under-engineered, and safety-challenged these cars really were. For all their economic importance, they were cars that, by modern standards, and even 1980s standards, were barely passable in quality, comfort, or protection. Let's dive into the K Car's origin, what made it a supposed miracle, and why it was, at its core, a risky compromise dressed in economy cloth. In the late 1970s, Chrysler was financially circling the drain. Years of poor management, outdated models, and bloated cars meant the company was losing market share rapidly to leaner Japanese imports and better-engineered American rivals. Then came Lee Iacocca, the man who had helped bring the Mustang to life at Ford. He joined Chrysler in 1978 and promised to turn things around. His masterstroke was the K platform, a simple, cheap front-wheel drive chassis that could underpin multiple car models with minimal investment. And thus, the 1981 Plymouth Reliant and Dodge Aries were born, the first K cars, and the mechanical life raft for a drowning company. Extremely boxy design, even by 1981 standards. Very lightweight, under 2,400 pounds, thanks to thin sheet metal and sparse interiors. Utilitarian, bland, and uninspired. No curves, no flair, no surprises. These cars were built to cut costs at every corner. Minimal use of chrome or decoration. Interiors with hard plastics, low-quality fabrics, and fragile dashboards. Components shared across the line to save money, including door handles, switches, and seats. They were often described as transportation appliances, not vehicles with soul, but basic machines to move you from point A to B. The base K cars came with a 2.2-liter inline-4 that produced just 84 horsepower. An optional Mitsubishi-sourced 2.6-liter 4-cylinder added a bit more torque, but was still sluggish. Performance was, let's be generous, uninspired. 0 to 60 miles per hour took nearly 14 seconds in base trim. Acceleration was flat, with a droning engine note and frequent transmission hunting. The automatic transmissions were lazy and prone to slipping under strain. The lightweight nature of the car meant fuel economy was decent, but it came at the cost of any real sense of power, authority, or engagement behind the wheel. Handling on the K car was marginal at best. The front-wheel drive setup was new for Chrysler and helped interior space, but the suspension was too soft and underdamped. On the highway, the Reliant and Aries were unstable at speeds over 60 miles per hour, with noticeable body roll and sway in crosswinds. Braking distances were long, and pedal feel was spongy and vague. You had to white-knuckle your way through high-speed lane changes, and cornering felt like asking the car for a favor it wasn't designed to grant. Safety was one of the most glaring weaknesses of the early K cars. Side impact protection was essentially non-existent. Thin doors, minimal internal bracing, and no airbags. The lightweight structure offered little protection in collisions, especially from the side or rear. The crashworthiness ratings by later standards were dismal. These were cars that crumpled easily, offering poor occupant survival space. What's worse, Seatbelts were rudimentary, often misaligned, and prone to malfunction. It was common to see wear-related failures in basic safety components, a serious oversight. Rust protection was also almost non-existent. Early K cars were notorious for severe rust problems, particularly in salt-heavy climates. Floor pans and wheel wells began rotting out within a few winters, and paint adhesion was poor. In many ways, these were disposable cars, not designed to last more than a few years. Now here's the ironic part. Despite all these flaws, the K car did its job for Chrysler. It allowed Chrysler to secure $1.5 billion in federal loan guarantees, which Iacocca famously repaid early. Over 1 million K cars were sold during their run, mostly to buyers who just wanted cheap, fuel-efficient American transportation. They also paved the way for the minivan revolution, using the same basic platform to birth the Dodge Caravan and Plymouth Voyager in 1984. But in terms of design excellence, safety, or long-term quality, the K car is more remembered as a symbol of desperation than innovation.